And we have made it to the month of September. I wish the thermometer knew that outside.
It's better than it was.
And it's not last year.
No.
Yes, every day in September was over 100 degrees. And yeah, better than last year for sure. So being September, we have made our move to the last prophetic theme for this year. Let me back up. I put the wrong one up. There we go. There we go. Y'all remember that list that we started out with at the beginning of 2024 of the prophetic themes we were going to explore? As we worship with doing a reading from the prophets, and the struggle was way too much to read in a year.
Oh, yeah, big books.
Yeah, and thick books.
Dense.
Dense, that's the word I was actually
Dense, yeah.
So we decided to work these themes and pick these out of the prophets because they're the ideas that keep coming up again and again and again. And really, the last two kind of go together, don't they? Restoration and
part one and part two.
The Messiah and his kingdom. Let's talk a little bit about that because we've kind of worked that some over the last few weeks, how this restoration theme ultimately culminates in the coming of the Messiah. And his kingdom.
Yeah, so restoration, kind of like we were talking about a little bit last month, is kind of begins with their restoration to the land out of Babylonian captivity. Those prophetic promises to give them hope in the midst of God's judgment that a remnant would be preserved, a remnant would return, and God would be with them. And of course, what happens is those promises of restoration that were fulfilled in terms of literally going back, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding Jerusalem. But many of those restoration promises gave glimpses of something bigger than just a literal physical return and rebuilding, and that's where those restoration prophecies begin to point towards the Messianic kingdom, the coming of the Messiah, something even bigger. Because again, the prophets foretold of an heir of David or David himself in Ezekiel's language, taking the throne again.
Right.
And the Jews are sitting there, they rebuild a temple, rebuild a city, and there is no Davidic king. There's got to be something more. Thus, Jesus shows up when the New Testament opens, and there's still great expectation that God has still got something great left to do. They were just still looking for the physical kingdom, a full physical restoration.
Right. In fact, sometimes it's hard when you're reading the prophets to distinguish between
very much so
when he is talking about that time,
and literal physical,
going back to the land and settling there and being blessed there, and when he is looking beyond the time, and you've heard us say before in the podcast that sometimes the problem with that is that we want this neat line between the two. Is this talking about then, or is this talking about the future? And really, if it's actually one long restoration period, there isn't a dividing line there. It kind of all flows together.
Well, that's one of the things that we miss sometimes is what the Jews actually came to understand is that there was a sense in which, even though they were back in the land, rebuilt the temple, rebuilt Jerusalem, the exile wasn't over because they were still under the control of foreign kings.
Right.
First the Persians when they first returned, then come the Greeks, then eventually come the Romans. And they had no king of their own. There was no Davidic king back on the throne. And so there was a sense in which by Jesus, they kind of still saw themselves as being in exile because while they were in the land, they did not control them. They were still occupied. And so, that's exactly right. That's why there was such a hope and longing that John the Baptist and Jesus tap into, but of course the Jews misunderstand.
That's interesting too, because it also seems like that Israel missed the bigger thing that God wanted to work on, that for them it was all about getting back in the land and getting our power back and, having our king. And they didn't really catch on to the bigger thing that God was working on, which was not building this physical kingdom, which still consumed them in the New Testament. They wanted somebody to run out the Romans.
Right.
But instead, the spiritual kingdom that God was dealing with, and the bigger problem, not captivity to the Babylonians, but captivity to sin.
Well, and you even see that in the way by Jesus' day, they have, again, misunderstood the prophets and what's been given to them. And so just like they were looking for some sort of physical restoration, they spiritually, even though they were keeping, the law of Moses by that point, you think about Pharisaism, where, so they learned the lesson, okay, God really doesn't like it when we are idolatrous and when we break the Sabbath. And so, the days of the Pharisees, all sorts of extra Sabbath regulations to make really, really, really sure they're not keeping the Sabbath. And Jesus comes along and says, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You've completely missed the point.
Right.
Or, Matthew 23, you guys will do all these outward, technical, physical manifestations of some sort of external holiness, the whitewashed tomb, as he called them, while inwardly you're still corrupt, the heart is still not right. And it's the same thing in terms of how they looked at restoration, a physical as opposed to something spiritual and bigger than. Because even if God solved the problem of, getting him back and even put a literal Davidic king back on a literal throne, you're still going to die. They were still missing the narrative of there's a bigger problem than even the fact that the Romans are occupying you. You're going to die, then what?
So one of the themes when you're reading through the prophets, and I think probably, in fairness, the one we are most familiar with, if we go back to the prophets, it's looking for these hints about the coming Messiah, the coming Savior, which is, if we're tying it to the broader biblical story, this is the seed of Abraham, right?
Yeah.
This is the descendant of David. So all throughout these prophecies have been pointing to the coming of Jesus in the world. So when we talk about the Messiah and his kingdom,
right,
you go back through the prophets, and there are these hints about God continuing to work this plan where he'll bring the descendant of Abraham into the world, Jesus Christ, to be the Messiah, to be the Savior.
And even to go very back, we already put up the themes that we've been working all year, even to go back to something we said at the very beginning of the year that we haven't actually said in a while, even beyond those themes, is that the right way to look at how these themes develop is under the covenantal framework they lived. They had the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, and the Davidic covenants. And part of what you're looking for in the prophets is the prophets' work in terms of these covenants. And even for today's reading, this week's reading, especially when it comes to this last theme of Messiah and Messianic kingdom, the Davidic covenant in particular becomes key. And you're going to see that even in our reading for this week, that the language goes to the Davidic covenant. And that's the key in which God is going to bring about this even greater restoration than they realized, because this is going to lead to something literally out of this world.
So that brings us to the reading for this week, Isaiah chapter 9. I thought it was so fitting, and I think probably not accidental, that you chose Isaiah for the first read, since his nickname is the Messianic prophet.
There's so much there
tied to the idea of Messiah. And so the point is that he's one of the prophets who particularly had a lot to say about the coming Messiah. We typically think of him that way. But you chose this reading from chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Why don't you talk about that a little bit, why you chose this particular one, which seems especially fitting.
Yeah, and hopefully familiar to some folks. I mean, you hear these words at a
some of it is for sure.
At a certain time of year, some of these words are invoked a lot.
Should have saved this for December. Right?
Yeah, maybe so. But hopefully some familiarity. But and again, you've read through the dark passages. Now we get to some stuff that's really beautiful and hopeful. And so it literally says, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. This is hope. And the ultimate hope, again, is not even getting back in the land. The real hope is the coming of somebody who could actually do something about everything. And so, very much, familiar words. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. I also think, given that we're coming up into the height of our
political season,
a good passage to remind us we are citizens of a better kingdom with a better ruler. And we need not to get so emotionally invested or troubled by what's going on. Not that, there aren't real problems out there, but, there's darkness out there. But we have seen a great, even more than, they were waiting for, we have seen the light. We know his name now. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. He has come. And that, the real solution to problems, the government is on his shoulders. He's the one who's going to set things right. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And then comes the kingdom language. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, and the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish and uphold it with justice and righteousness.
There's that Davidic connection,
that's
by
right.
the way.
Yeah, the Davidic covenant. That's
Don't
right.
miss that. He talks about his connection back to King David.
That's right. But this is our hope, and this is what you got to keep. Maybe until the election's over. This is what you need to be taping on your bathroom mirror to remind yourself when you get up and when you go to bed. Use Deuteronomy language there. When you rise up and when you lie down, this is who we are. This is where our hope is, and this is light in the midst of darkness for us. And so, we are, because the Messianic kingdom has been established.
Yeah.
We are living in it. And that's good news.
Let's address two things,
Okay.
because I suspect as you guys read this, there may be a couple of these that trip you up, because you have these descriptions of who Jesus is
Right.
in verse 6, and every once in a while people get a little confused by a couple of them.
Okay.
Probably Eternal Father
Yeah.
is the one that throws people the most, because Father, Son, and Spirit, right?
Right,
We get
right.
that, but here Jesus is called Father, and people get confused about that.
Yeah. No, when you look at that in context, right, because it's in the midst of a list of things.
Correct.
And so when you look at the list, it's describing roles, not roles or functions, not inherent identity. Because, he calls him a wonderful counselor or a prince of peace. Does that rule out his divinity? Or he's called a prince instead of a king. Okay, well, what about, no. These are kind of roles, ways of getting around or getting your mind around the role that he does. He's the good shepherd. He's a father to children, which means he's a protector, a provider. And again, ironically, kings were viewed, as shepherds in the ancient world. That shepherd language wasn't just kind of comforting the way we kind of hear Psalm 23 or John, John's gospel, I am the good shepherd. In the ancient world, kings, or especially in the ancient Near East, the Romans didn't work this quite as much, but the ancient Near East, kings were shepherds. They were royal too and expected you to take them more seriously than the lowly shepherd. But it described a role or a function, and that's how you need to hear everlasting Father.
Right.
He is this paternal protector and provider to his people, to his kingdom.
It seems to me that we need to allow the Bible to do exactly what we do, because we use the word Father in exactly that way. Sometimes I am a father because my wife and I have two sons. And so in a literal biological sense, I am a father to these boys. But, you could take the term father and you could apply it to a single man who had no biological connection in any way to a young man in his life. Maybe a single college professor takes a young man under his wing who's having a hard time, maybe doesn't have a father figure.
Right.
And that young man grows up to say, when I was at a critical time in my life, he was a father to me, not biologically speaking, but he played the role
That's right.
of father to me.
Paul to Timothy, Paul calls Timothy his son in the faith.
Yeah, and they weren't literally
No, that's
father
right.
and son, but he filled a role
That's
that
right.
Timothy needed.
And
him
that's
to fill.
exactly what's going on. Anymore, you want to look at the phrase "mighty God" and then say, okay, so that's a nice Trinitarianism because.
Oh, I was getting ready to
apparently,
say that throws people off too, because he is
no.
called Mighty God,
Yeah.
and again, that's just a misunderstanding of the way the word God is used. Just like Father can have some different dimensions to its meaning, so God can refer to deity, and I think in that case is what it means.
And even to go even back again, hearing this with ancient ears, and his name shall be called, and he gives a bunch of names.
Right.
Names are roles, right? And the ancient kings had multiple names. They had the name they were given. They were born. They had their throne name that they take. And so his name in this case is his role. These are names, roles that he is acquiring.
Yeah. So that might help you if that was a point that tripped you up in your reading this week. Verses 1 through 7 of chapter 9 in Isaiah. And remember, this month we're looking at passages that point us to Jesus. Now, before we wrap up, we also have a new minor prophet this week.
Oh, yes, we do.
The prophet Joel.
Yeah.
We've got
4 chapters.
Yeah, and we've got 4 left.
Yeah.
Wrap up this year, having read through all the minor prophets, if you've been keeping up with the reading. So, quick word about Joel. You want to say anything about that?
Sure. Dating him is hard. That's why he usually is kind of an outlier. But otherwise, it's a relatively short prophet. Perhaps for some of us most familiar because Peter famously quotes a crucial section at the end of Joel chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost to basically say what's happening on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 when the gospel is being preached publicly for the first time in the church being established is being fulfilled right then and there in their ears. And so, but overall, Joel kind of, it's a mix of judgment and God then cleaning up the mess after judgment. And of course, ironically, the passage that Peter quotes in Acts 2 is God cleaning up the mess after judgment. Perhaps one of the most familiar parts of the or famous parts of the judgment part of Joel is a description of a locust plague.
Locust plague.
Now, commentators debate, was that a literal locust plague that came and ate up all their crops, which was one of the worst fears you had in the ancient world. Because again, you're going hungry. There's a United Nations, or UNICEF or something that's going to truck in some food for you. or whether it was a description of a military invasion, which again, similarly doesn't just destroy, but one of the ways that armies fed themselves when they invaded was, they ate your crops. They ate as they went, and so they wiped you out, both literally in terms of destroying you, but also taking, even for those of who survived the invasion, there it all goes. And so there's some, it's a mix of judgment and hope, standard prophetic stuff there. Hard to be sure exactly what era, debated a little bit exactly what era Joel fits into.
So working through Joel this month and looking for prophecies that point us to Jesus. So we're starting in Isaiah 9. Hope you'll keep up with your Bible reading in September.